Okay, so we're going to look at how to collect a trace in Dynamics AX. The version of AX that I'm using here is AX 2009. However, these instructions should work for AX4 as well. So to begin, we need to start with the server configuration utility and get that set up and running. It is key when doing all of these tasks that you run these as administrator. And when it comes up, you'll want to create a new configuration if you don't already have one. I'll just call mine tracing. And let's navigate over to the tracing tab, and we'll want to enable these options here. And a quick description is that RPC trips, as it says, are round trips to the server. Any X++ method that is marked server and is called from the client will incur an RPC call. So we would want to trace those. All X++ method calls, and we're going to go ahead and increase this number of nested calls up to 99. You can enable function calls if you want. These are built-in X++ functions. Typically there's not any time spent in them, so I leave them out, but up to you. Moving over to the SQL side, we will want to collect SQL statements and enable bind variables. That is the data that is passed to each of the SQL statements. One thing to note is that this will contain data that is in your database, so if you're going to be sharing this trace with anybody, it can contain personal information. And the last thing we'll want to enable here is the row fetch summary count and time. That just gives us timing information when a select statement is done. Now down at the bottom here under client tracing, this is probably the most important setting. We want to allow client tracing on application object server instance. And what this does on the server side is it allows the client to start the trace and signal the server to collect a corresponding trace, so that way we can get the information for only the scenario that we're looking to perform. After you enable this, it will require a restart of the AOS, so make sure to keep that in mind in your planning. You may want to restart that after production is done for the day or when there's downtime in the system. So I'm going to go ahead and hit apply, and it will ask if I want to restart the AOS. I'm just going to allow it to restart here. But while that's going ahead and restarting, I'm going to pull up the client configuration utility, and again we'll want to run this as administrator and create a new configuration. And now we'll want to go ahead and enable the same options over here. So I'm just repeating what I did over there and hit apply, and obviously there's no checkbox for allow client tracing here. This is the client and it will be initiating the trace. So we'll go ahead and wait for that service to restart. Okay, it looks restarted now. So on the server configuration utility here, I'm just going to go ahead and close it because we will no longer need that. Actually, one thing to note in there, if we pull it back up, is under the tracing tab it contains the log directory location, and this is actually the directory that's going to write the trace file into. So from the AOS point of view, you're going to be running the service as a specific user. You'll want to make sure that that user has write access to this folder. And additionally, you want to make sure that that service has administrator rights for collecting the trace. That is required for collecting AX trace. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this and open up an Explorer so we can see that. Okay, right now it's empty. Now I'm going to go ahead and close this again. And now go over to the tracing tab on the client configuration utility, and these are the two buttons that we'll need. It's the start trace and stop trace. I don't suggest starting the trace until you're ready to perform your scenario. That is very critical. We want to collect as little information as possible and keep that tightly coupled around the scenario that we're performing. So what I'm going to do is open up the AX client, and note it again, we are running it as administrator, and that's for the access rights to the AX tracing. And we'll go ahead and just pick a simple form here and open it and close it, and we won't be collecting a big trace here. So go ahead and click Start Trace. Now to verify that the trace is started, it does take a few minutes here. We can do a logman query -ets, And you will see here that the client trace is started, and down here that has kicked off the corresponding server trace. So now that the traces are running, we can go and pull up any window within AX here. And we could just, do whatever scenario that is currently slow and then stop the trace. In this case, I'm just going to close the window and go back to the client configuration utility and stop the trace. And again, it can take up to 10 seconds for that to stop as well, but we can use the same command, pause a little bit, and verify that the tracing has stopped. So here those have disappeared. And if we go over to the directory that we opened up, here is the AOS as prefixed with the AOS on the beginning there. And again, you can also do this for the client. The client trace is going to be in the directory on the client configuration utility. So we'll just open up that location and I'll show you the client trace, and here's the client trace. So anytime you want to collect a trace for your scenario that is showing slow performance, you want to put both these traces in the same location, zip them up. These actually do compress really well, so the better zip compression algorithm you can use. Some of the external tools such as WinZip or 7-Zip can do higher compression than built-in Windows. These will compress to a really small size, and you can share those out with Premier Field engineering team or the product team of AX. So the only last thing to note is that when you start these traces, it actually is looking at a registry key internally, and here is the client registry key, and it's, you can see down at the bottom, it's computer, HKey current user, software, Microsoft Dynamics. And if we go to the configuration that we created here, just going to scroll down to the bottom, and under all the keywords prefixed with trace, that's everything that controls tracing. But the one thing to keep in mind is this trace max file size. So there's two purposes of this. Whatever this is set to, which is 10 gigabytes by default, you will want to make sure that there is enough free disk space in the folder that is pointed to by the client configuration and the server configuration utility. And that's 10 gigabyte per trace, so by default it's set up to need 20 gigabytes of disk space. So you might want to modify that to something smaller, such as 1 gigabyte. And the other thing to note with that is once it reaches that size, so if you're doing some type of long-running trace and it reaches to the trace max file size, it will stop the trace at that point. So you won't get any more events after that file fills up. So go ahead and collect a trace, share that out, keep all these things in mind in order to troubleshoot any issues. Thank you.